Hello everyone. In today's lecture we will be examining the ethnic and sectarian violence which occurred during the 70s and 80s in Northern Ireland, normally described under the term the Troubles. Now, this violence continued in the 1990s, but we shall look at that later period of the Troubles as well as their end in a future lecture. Today we shall concern ourselves with the origins of the Troubles and their most violent early period. We last examined Ireland in the 1930s, noting how Eamon de Valera utilised anti-British sentiment to dominate the politics of his country in that period and throw off the rule of the British monarchy. De Valera, however, was unable to reincorporate the northern 6 counties of the island of Ireland into his country. Indeed, the incorporation of these 6 counties, many of whose population were Protestants and considered themselves British, not Irish, would have damaged de Valera's project of building a Catholic nation-state proud of its Irish identity. It is worth here taking a moment to consider the people and history of Northern Ireland and how trends in these 6 counties differed from some of those in the rest of the island. In the early modern period, the kingdoms of England and Scotland both launched extensive settler policies in Ireland. This involved taking Protestants from their own countries and giving them land, some of the best land in Ireland, to farm in return for loyalty. This process, known as plantation, was more extensive in Ulster, the northern part of Ireland, where most of the settlers came from Scotland. Thus, gradually, an Ulster Scots identity formed, distinct from other English, Irish, and Scottish identities. This group, also known as the Scots-Irish, were distinguished from many of the English settlers, the Anglo-Irish, by their Presbyterian religion. Many Ulster Scots emigrated abroad. President Andrew Jackson of the USA, for example, was descended from a prominent Ulster Scottish family. All of this becomes relevant as both the Ulster Scots and the Anglo-Irish had distinct differences from the Irish Catholic majority already living on the island. Whilst many landowners enjoyed extensive privileges over the Catholics, particularly before and during the Great Famine, many of Ireland's Protestants were not actually rich and, like the poor whites of the US South, supported the unjust balance of power in Ireland more for reasons of personal pride than for economics. They eyed the growing rights given to the Irish Catholics by the government in Westminster with suspicion. In particular, Irish Protestants opposed Home Rule, the idea of giving Ireland a separate parliament in Dublin, as they felt that this would result in Catholic domination and reverse discrimination. In the meantime, the northern counties of Ireland became some of the richest parts of the entire British Empire, with the largest city, Belfast, enjoying a booming textile and shipbuilding industry. Famously, the Titanic was assembled at the Belfast shipyards in the early years of the 1900s. Belfast's industrialisation brought many Catholics into the city, seeking employment in the factories. These Catholics were resented by their Protestant neighbours and largely lived in their own neighbourhoods within Belfast. Strong neighbourhood identities formed, similar to those formed in Glasgow in Scotland and Liverpool in England. Political developments proceeded apace, even when the Great Titanic was being built. Thousands of Irish who opposed Home Rule, now known as Unionists under their charismatic leader Edward Carson, had signed a solemn covenant to resist it in 1912. In January 1913, the Unionists established a paramilitary army, the Ulster Volunteer Force, or UVF, to coordinate armed resistance. In September 1913, Carson announced that a provisional government in Ulster would be established in the event of Home Rule coming into effect. After first seeking to reject Home Rule for all of Ireland, the Unionists now demanded a separate deal for Ulster to be excluded from the rest of the country. As a result, when Ireland received effective independence in 1922, Ulster, or Northern Ireland as it was now known, separated. It received its own parliament, made up mostly of Protestants, and its own Prime Minister, the Protestant James Craig, of Scottish and aristocratic heritage. Many Irish Protestants in the rest of the island subsequently moved to Northern Ireland, strengthening its Protestant character. The Catholic minority in Northern Ireland, about 500,000 strong in 1922, found itself under a great deal of pressure. Catholics suffered discrimination in employment, public housing, education, and social services. Gerrymandering minimized their ability to gain parliamentary representation. Still, Northern Ireland's successful economy continued to draw Catholic migrants, particularly during the 1930s, desperate and hungry years down south in the Irish Free State. After 1945, Catholics in Northern Ireland still discriminated against, benefited from the social welfare reforms of the British Labour government. This prevented many from moving out of the country. By the mid-1960s, the stability of Northern Ireland began to erode. The demographic majority that the Protestants enjoyed ensured that they were able to control the state institutions, and they continued to discriminate against the Catholic minority. An active civil rights movement, inspired by the achievements of Black Americans in the civil rights movement in the US, emerged in the late 1960s. At first, many members of the civil rights movement were Protestants, although fault lines gradually emerged as Protestants consistently attempted to pursue a moderate position, and Catholics pushed for full and immediate equality. The government of Northern Ireland feared that the civil rights movement was a front for Irish nationalists seeking reunification and cracked down hard. Protestant militias joined the fighting as incidents of communal violence increased. The police began using force to disperse demonstrators from the streets and raided Catholic neighbourhoods in Belfast and Derry, a city that Unionists refer to as Londonderry. Demands for reform were raised with increasing desperation, and as they were, the equally fervent insistence that there should be no reforms at all produced a deadly dynamic that brought Northern Ireland to the brink of civil war. In the increasing chaos of the time, many Irish Catholics in Northern Ireland began to turn to paramilitary forces, most notably the Provisional IRA, for protection. The original IRA, or Irish Republican Army, had fought in the Irish Independence War in the 1920s, and since then had struggled for a full reunification of their island, either through fighting the government in Dublin or by launching bombing campaigns in England and in the Irish borderlands. In August 1969, a Protestant organisation in Derry marched through the Bogside area of the city, a Catholic neighbourhood. The subsequent Battle of the Bogside saw Catholics in Belfast rise up in solidarity. As the police cracked down, many Catholics accused the IRA of not doing enough to protect them. A split resulted in the IRA, and most IRA members in Belfast went over to the Provisional IRA, or Provos. The Provos initiated a massive recruitment drive of young Catholics known as the 69ers, and adopted the symbol of the phoenix to represent dreams of a united Ireland returning after 50 years. The Provos acquired arms and explosives and initiated a campaign of bombings and shootings in order to protect Roman Catholics, destabilize Northern Ireland's institutions, weaken the British resolve to maintain the Union, and achieve Irish unification. Many formed connection with allies around the world, either communists or members of national liberation struggles in Asia and Africa. That said, the Provos were not a socialist organisation, but always a nationalist one first and foremost. The Northern Irish Police Force, the IUC, was quickly overwhelmed, and the government in London sent the British Army into Northern Ireland, massively intensifying the conflict. Belfast became a literal war zone, with soldiers and civilians fighting each other whilst ordinary people lived their life in the streets. On December 19th, 1971, a pub, McGurk's Bar in Belfast, was blown up, killing 15 people and 2 children. The perpetrators were not the IRA, rather the victims themselves had been Catholic. The bombing had been carried out by the UVF, who committed a number of other attacks on Catholic civilians and shot the organisation to widespread fame. The Protestants had responded to the threat of the IRA and of unification by declaring no surrender and tightening their communal bonds. A key force driving the Protestant resistance was Ian Paisley, leader of a church that he had himself founded, the Free Presbyterians. Paisley also founded his own political party, the Democratic Ulster Party, or DUP. He strove to become the leader of extreme Protestant opinion in Northern Ireland by organising street protests and rallies. Despite his self-professed loyalty to the UK, Paisley's maverick actions led to frequent confrontations with the authorities, and he was even sent to jail for a brief while in 1966. Paisley's strength lay in his ability to speak in a clear, certain way when many Protestants were uncertain about their identity and fearful of their lives. He was popular among the poorer members of the community for criticizing the wealthier Protestants as out of touch and as being traitors. In January 1972, the British troops in Northern Ireland earned worldwide infamy for committing an atrocity against civilians. British paratroopers, observing a peaceful Sunday protest in Derry, opened fire on the crowd, killing 14 civilians. This event, Bloody Sunday, permanently delegitimised the soldiers' mission to keep the peace in Ireland. Many British officials either tried to cover up what had happened or untruthfully blamed the Irish crowds for starting the violence. It wasn't until June 2010 with the Savile Report that a final pronouncement of a government inquiry initiated by the British Prime Minister Tony Blair concluded that none of the victims had posed any threat to the soldiers and that their shooting was entirely without justification. As Irish communities sought to avenge the death of those who had died in Derry, and the Protestants continued to rally to Paisley and the UVF, 1972 became the most violent year in the Troubles, a year of unmitigated violence and destruction. The British paratroopers were involved in more massacres, killing mostly Irish Catholics, but also Protestants in the Unionist Shankill neighbourhood of Belfast. 467 people, including 321 civilians, were killed in that year. In March 1972, Conservative British Prime Minister Edward Heath suspended the Constitution and Parliament of Northern Ireland and restored direct rule from London, which would last until 1999. Among several initiatives to restore Home Rule, the first, known as the Sunningdale Agreement, led to the creation in 1973 of a short-lived assembly in which Catholics were given some political authority. Nevertheless, violence continued, and the power-sharing executive collapsed after only a few months because of a strike organised by the Protestant Ulster Workers' Council, a committee backed by paramilitaries. The British then threatened to leave under the premiership of Harold Wilson, granting Northern Ireland independence and leaving it to its fate. They were encouraged to stay by the government of the Republic of Ireland, which feared unmitigated violence and destruction would break out should Northern Ireland become independent under Protestant leadership. The Republic of Ireland itself continued to be beset by economic strife and emigration, yet the government in Dublin adopted a firm line on the Northern Ireland issue and demanded a greater say in affairs there. Northern Irish Unionists were strongly opposed to giving their southern neighbour a say in matters. However, many British political leaders, including Margaret Thatcher, the bellicose Prime Minister who came to power in 1979, had come to believe that a solution to years of violence in Northern Ireland could only be achieved by means of an All-Ireland agreement. At the end of 1981, the Irish and British set up an Anglo-Irish Intergovernmental Council to discuss matters of common concern, especially security. In 1984, the report of the New Ireland Forum, a discussion group that included political parties in Ireland and Northern Ireland, set out three possible frameworks for political development: either a centralised state run from Dublin, a federal state, or joint sovereignty. Also in the early 1980s in Northern Ireland, John Hume, the leader of the Social Democratic and Labour Party, gathered the support of prominent Irish American political leaders in condemning the use of violence and urging Irish Americans not to support the IRA. Previously, the IRA had received much of its funding from Irish Americans who retained memories of British crimes upon their families and were safely distant from the violence. Hume's group also encouraged Ronald Reagan to persuade Thatcher to pursue closer relations with Ireland. These efforts were somewhat overshadowed by an assassination attempt by the IRA on the Prime Minister herself. The IRA planted a bomb in a hotel in Brighton, England, that only failed to kill the Prime Minister due to her habit of staying up late in the night working at her desk rather than sleeping in her bed. 5 people were killed and 31 injured. Mrs. Thatcher will now realise that the British cannot occupy our country and shoot our people in their own streets and get away with it. Today we were unlucky, but remember we only have to be lucky once, said an IRA statement. The Prime Minister responded by declaring her continued survival a victory for democracy over terrorism. From now, however, British officials could not pretend that Northern Ireland was a faraway place. The war had been brought home. Finally, the British and Irish concluded the Anglo-Irish Agreement in 1985, which marked the first time that the Government of Ireland was given an official consultative role in the affairs of Northern Ireland. Considered one of the most significant developments in relations since the establishment of the Irish Free State, the agreement provided for regular meetings between ministers in the Irish and British governments on matters affecting Northern Ireland. It outlined cooperation in political matters, security, legal matters, and the promotion of cross-border cooperation. Unionists were outraged. The Ulster Unionist Party and other Unionists denounced the agreement, and UUP members of Parliament resigned their seats over the issue. The party organised mass protests and boycotts of local councils and filed a lawsuit challenging the agreement. However, these efforts failed to force an end to the agreement. Bombing and violence would continue meanwhile over the following decade.